Hello, I'm Gurnek Bains, CEO of Global Future Think Tank, and welcome to Lens, our new blog series that will endeavour to shine psychological light and insight onto topical world issues. Now, the issue that I want to touch on today is vaccine hesitancy, and specifically different cultural attitudes to that. Because as the vaccine rolls out and supplies of the vaccine become less of a constraint, this is going to be one of the things that potentially blocks us. Because even if 15% of the vulnerable population in a society resists the vaccine, this becomes a huge problem once lockdowns end in terms of disease and hospitalisation. So this is an issue well worth looking at. And what I want to do is get under the skin of these cultural differences so we can empathise with them and develop effective strategies. Firstly, there are huge differences globally across the world in attitudes to the vaccine. In China, India, South Korea and parts of Asia, over 80% of people will say they're willing to take it. In Europe and America, the figures are in the 60 to 70%, still high. But in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Afro-Caribbean and Eastern Europe, the figures are much lower and often well below 50%. Now, these differences are actually mirrored within societies. So in the UK, the white population, Indian and Chinese, are very high in terms of embracing the vaccine. But amongst Afro-Caribbeans, Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, the figures are well below 50%. And similarly in the US, the figures are high for the white communities, but well below 50% for the Hispanic population and the black population. So what explains these differences? Well, I want to touch on two factors. The first I'm going to call close-in trust versus faraway trust. Now, societies around the world vary tremendously in who they trust. In some small-scale societies and less developed societies, trust is extended only to family, clan and people close to you. In others, it's extended much more widely. There's an instrument called the General Trust Questionnaire, which asks people, in general, do you trust people? And it logs those responses. In Scandinavia, 70% of people say they generally trust the people around them. In Trinidad and Tobago, that figure goes down to 4%, and similarly low in some East European societies as well, and in Africa. Within countries, there are also huge variations. So in America, in New Hampshire, 60 or 70% of people will answer yes to these questionnaires. But in Alabama and Mississippi, the figures go down to 20%. Now, these attitudes are also mirrored in experiments in behavioural economics on trust, where what you receive is influenced by the level of trust you're able to extend to distant others. And they absolutely parallel these impersonal trust scores across cultures. Now, the vaccine, unless it's invented by your uncle or your friend down the road, comes from a distant place. And so in those communities that only trust locally and more close in, there is incredible levels of distrust of that. The second factor I want to talk about is attitudes to institutions. In my book, Cultural DNA, I say the drumbeat of history reverberates through every culture and influences critical attitudes. Now, attitudes to institutions, I think, are one of those areas. So if you take the UK Afro-Caribbean population or the US black population, well, think about it. What's their experience of institutions going back 300 or 400 years? From the African rulers who sold them into slavery, the slave traders, the slave owners, the people who emancipated them and then put stringent rules on them, their universal experience of 300 or 400 years of institutions has been negative. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, the institutions that were put in place after the war weren't trusted and were seen often to be alien and at variance with people's interests. Now, you don't just flick a switch and develop respect for institutions just like that. It takes time, and generations of experience builds suspicion. And that, for me, is the second factor that really explains these variations. Now, of course, there are a number of other things. Religious attitudes, how independent your society is, what the level of prevalence of the disease is. And the other thing to note is that these attitudes to the vaccine are likely to prove to be highly variable as evidence mounts. But I think these two factors need to be taken into account if we're to develop effective solutions. So what does that mean? It means empathizing with people rather than dismissing them as being stupid or ignorant or illiterate for not embracing the vaccine. It means looking at the institutions and the people that they will trust, the mosques, the churches, the close-in family members, the community support networks. Now, that's not just empathetic and the right thing to do. We need to embrace this attitude because it's safer for us and safer for the world to do that. So thank you for listening to this blog. We'll see you next time, and the next blog will be taking an interesting look at the whole area of unconscious bias. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you again.